Constitutionalists, and welcome to the Free for All Friday edition of the Dan Clements Show, Christian political talk show. This is episode 813. I'm your host, Dan Clements, your constitutional warrior, fighting for your right just to be an American. I am broadcasting live from the Hemlock Studios here in the beautiful central Susquehanna Valley in the great Keystone State before the great John Wayne desk. Oh, folks, what a wonderful day it is. It's the last day of the week. Today we're going to be talking about some of my favorite subjects about free markets. Not so much about the environment as far as one of my favorite subjects, but in relationship to the free markets, gotta love it. Gotta love the environment when you start talking about the free markets, because the free markets, folks, the free markets are better for the environment. We'll talk about that during the show today. Rocky Mountain High Brands is the official drink of the Dan Clements Show. I drink them on a daily basis. The hemp oil infusion in them, 100 milligrams, seems to help with my muscle aches and pains with my fibromyalgia. And I'm not saying this is something that can be quantified. I'm not a doctor, although I did stay in a Holiday Inn Express last night. However, it just seems to work. It's an antidote for you guys. it's antidotal. But anyway. They have a bunch of different flavors. Right now on the East Coast, the only place you can get them is on Amazon.com by the case. It's well worth the money. It's around $2 a can. I'm sure that price is going to come down once they hit the stores or be in that same neighborhood. But I get free shipping on my Amazon, so it doesn't matter to me. So this is the official drink of the Dan Clements Show. And full disclosure, I do own stock in the company. So the more you drink and the more you buy, the more my stock goes up, which is a good thing. Because I am a capitalist. I'm a free market capitalist, and I live in a free market society. All right, let's see here. Today's daily Bible reading comes from Romans chapter 8, verses 35 through 39. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword? As it is written, for your sake we are killed all day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. Yet in all things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am persuaded that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. And I just want to concentrate on that verse 37 through 39 about nothing can separate us from the love of Christ except us. We're the only people that can separate us. There's no external power outside of us that can separate us from the love of Christ. Today's quote mail is from an unknown author. Sin is like quicksand. Your own efforts only make you sink deeper. Only an outside hand can pull you out. Think about that. In the short Bible lesson today that's going to be over at the danclements.com show notes page, is a sermon on the Old Testament. Why cite the Old Testament? This is by Bill Jackson from gewatkins.net. It's a sermon outline. It's a really good sermon lesson. And a lot of times I'll take these outlines from G.E. Watkins and I'll use them for study guides. And it's set up perfectly to use as a study guide. So please go over to danclementshow.com and click on that. And if you're struggling to find subjects to study on, by all means, use gewatkins.net. And if you don't want to go that far, at least use the sermon outline that I shared with you today about why cite the Old Testament. It's very important. A lot of evangelical Christians today, denominational Christians, don't even go into the Old Testament. They strictly stick with the New Testament, and they're missing the whole reason why we have the New Testament. And to me, that's not a good thing at all. Okay, the news of the day is Trump's pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords, which only amounts to a redistribution of wealth to foreign countries. This is an article by Melanie Archer from cnsnews.com. And before we start getting into all the hoopla about the Paris Climate Accords, this is just what President Obama had signed as president and never had ratified by the Senate. So this accord to begin with, which all this, there's been so much ink, so much digital, physical and digital ink that's been spilled about the Paris Climate Accords, and I've been saying this for a long time, that they're unconstitutional. In order for us to be part of a treaty and start acting part of this treaty, the Senate has to pass it. I mean, the Senate literally has to pass it, and the problem is they haven't. Barack Obama, as he is wont to do throughout his whole presidency, has done an end run around the Constitution. And this is just, to me, this is just another example of an impeachable offense. He signed these accords, didn't take it to Congress, and then wants the country to implement everything about it. And this is a theme with the anti-freedom groups out there, folks. This is a big theme. And I use this every now and then. It's the Overton window. And you have freedom on the top and you have less freedom on the bottom, or I call anti-freedom. And the way you get to both of these is through the same process, but just with different ideologies. You go from the unthinkable to radical to acceptable to sensible to popular to policy. And I believe once you get down to policy, you become a centrist. And a lot of times, because a lot of times the policy that's being put into practice is just that. It's just policy, folks. And sometimes it's unconstitutional. A lot of times it's unconstitutional. So I just wanted to put that out to you, as I'm wont to do a lot of times. So President Trump's pulling out of the accords. Fantastic, great. I think it's the best thing he could have done, because it's unconstitutional to begin with. So we'll see what the future holds with that. And there's been some commentary on this by none other than our favorite Congresswoman, Nancy Pelosi. And I need to get over to that. Let's see here. Quitting the Paris Climate Agreement is a moral disgrace. And this is a story from Vox.com by Jim Tankersley. And this isn't, I thought this was the one about Nancy Pelosi, but Jim goes on to talk about, he says, no laid-off coal miners will get their jobs back from President Trump's pulling the United States from the Paris Accord on climate change. No extra oil rigs will sprout in the Gulf. There's no employment upside to an American first retreat from the global leadership on one of the few issues that can actually be described as potentially existential threat to mankind. I got to stop the reading there. This again, this whole climate change is a politically motivated issue. It's not motivated by pure science. Matter of fact, there's so much science out there that contradicts the prevailing political view of climate change that it's just unreal, folks. And and the problem is, you have the lamestream media, you have the deep state, you have liberals out there, anti-freedom crowd out there that is so wedded to the idea about we're killing ourselves, mankind is causing the climate change, and we're killing ourselves, but the science that's being used is garbage. It's garbage science, and they're reading everything wrong. And this is something we're going to continue to develop next week on shows next week. And it amazes me how many people are gullible. And this goes to this whole idea that I've been running along here, that people they don't know what they don't know. They're not thinking through what they believe in, things like that. The whole apparatus and stand. Jim goes on to say there's only the profound immorality of abdication, a gleefully passing a mounting problem onto our children and onto the poor. Again, what problem? The climate has changed and will continue to change until the good Lord comes, since God created the earth. And for them to say that mankind is the driving force, and what with climate change, and the big thing they're talking about is CO2 emissions. Do you know what Do you know what entity, and I'm just going to use this in the loosest form of the term, do you know what entity on the planet belches out more CO2 than mankind ever thought they could? Nature. It's nature. When plant matter dies and decays, it gives off CO2. We can't stop that. The oceans, when they warm up, they give off CO2. When they cool down, they actually suck CO2 back down into them. I don't know how that all works. I just know scientists have discovered that that works. But in the grand scheme of things, mankind, since the Industrial Revolution, has put a pittance of CO2 into the atmosphere compared to nature. I don't know how they're going to stop nature. I really don't. I've seen this company over in Sweden, I think it is, or Switzerland, Sweden, I think it is, that built this machine that takes 90,000 tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere, or 9,000, I'm not sure which. I think it was 90,000 tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere. And they're going to sell it to these greenhouses. They're going to put it in carbonated drinks. I don't know what they think about when you open up a carbonated drink and it starts fizzing and stuff and all that CO2 comes off of it. So what are they really doing? It's ridiculous. This whole argument about climate change is ridiculous. And I don't deny that climate changes. And this is where you have to be careful about the argument. They never say, the anti-freedom crowd out there never says, human-caused climate change. All they do is they just climate change. They never tell you what's behind their ideology. It's human-caused climate change. So every time you hear an anti-freedom, progressive politician or individual in one of the watermelon environmental groups out there say climate change, always put human-caused in front of it. Matter of fact, you can make up a little sign and put on your flat screen TV when environmentalist comes on to speak, and you can say human-caused climate change. Because that's what it is. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about mankind destroying the planet. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Jim goes on in this article to say, Trump said Thursday he will fulfill a campaign promise and withdraw the U.S. from the agreement, which aims to put the world on a path to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. He called it financially draconian, cited a puffed-up study on political costs to the economy, and said he would seek a better deal for America. I happen to love coal miners, he said at one point, in case you didn't see what the target audience is for the decision. Again, they're running off, Jim and Vox is running off a false premise here. And they won't get off this, and I've talked about this for a long time. They have this idea, this conclusion that they've come to. So what they're going to do is they're going to go back and cherry pick. They're not only going to cherry pick the facts, they're going to cherry pick stories, ignore others. They're going to call things differently than what they actually are, like human-caused climate change. They're just going to call it climate change to support their conclusion. And anybody that, and this is where I don't care what people say to me on social media, okay? But this is where social media comes in and does a poor job. They come in without the facts, and if you agree with the conclusion of the watermelon environmentalists out there and the anti-freedom crowds, if you agree with their conclusions, then you get pretty much crucified on social media. Now, I'm the type of individual, I don't care what you say about me. You don't know me. I'm not going to try, I'll defend myself, but not the way you think I'm going to defend myself, by apologizing for my positions. Because what you're practicing, whether you know it or not, is called Kafka trapping. Put up these accusations like, climate denier or racist or homophobe or Islamophobe, stuff like that, and try to force an individual to apologize for their stance. And then when they apologize, you have them. Well, what are you apologizing for if you aren't these things? So you got to be very careful about that. So I never apologize for my positions unless I was actually wrong. And I'm not going to give in to their pressure. I'm going to actually look at the facts and weigh the facts out for myself, because I'm a common sense, logical, reasonable human being that has a monicum of intelligence that can read and understand things. And so when they come in here and they say the sky is falling with the Paris Climate Agreement is a moral disgrace, they're starting to, and this is funny, the freedom crowd out there has always crouched their arguments to some degree as a moral obligation or immorality. You know, it's immoral for you to go beyond the Constitution, for the federal government to go beyond the Constitution and the enumerated powers, tax the people, which would be stealing if you're taking above and beyond what the Constitution says the government's supposed to be doing, and spending it on these unconstitutional programs. That's immoral. Stealing is always immoral. So if you go, if I have a budget at home and I actually added things to the budget that I can't afford on my income, but I go out and steal to make up the difference, is that moral? No, it's not moral. And this is folks, this is no different from the federal government doing the same thing. The federal government has enumerated powers, and these are the only powers they're supposed to be exercising. Anything above and beyond that's unconstitutional. And if they tax the American citizen or the American people, if they tax them for that extra constitutional, unconstitutional, whatever, how you ever want to phrase it, programs and powers, that is stealing. The anti-freedom group doesn't want to hear that. Well, taxation isn't stealing. Well, it depends on what type of taxation you're talking about. But they never want to go that far. They always want to keep it on the surface. They don't want people to dig below the surface, because as soon as they start digging below, especially with the anti-freedom crowd, especially with the watermelon environmentalist movement that supports this idiotic claim of human caused climate change, you'll see how rotten it is below. There's no foundation. You start digging down, you don't find the foundation. Everything's on the surface. It's like putting a cement pad just on the surface without of the ground without any type of footer or foundation underneath it. Eventually it's going to crack and break up because there's no foundation. And this is the same thing with the anti-freedom groups. They have all this stuff on the surface, which is mostly emotional. They're attacking people by using emotions and trying to get them to think a way that they want them to think. And by going after people and trying to play on their emotions, we see that that's all it is, and there's no foundation for it. You know, my beliefs have been lifelong, evolving, changing, being corrected by myself, and I find new information that, you know, contradicts something I believe in, and, you know, I have a choice whether I want to still believe in it, even though I might be wrong, or change. You know, it's like when I became a Christian. I grew up Catholic all, you know, my young adult life, and when I finally found the truth of the New Testament and salvation in that, it challenged my belief system. And I could have stayed Catholic. I could have just said, nope, I don't believe that stuff, and just stayed Catholic and stayed ignorant in my spiritual walk in life. But I looked at the facts. I looked at the New Testament, what the Bible was actually saying. I'm like, this makes sense. Catholicism doesn't. So I had to make a choice, and I did. And this is something we should be doing throughout our lives. We should be challenging what we believe. You know, someone asked me why I believe what I believe. I need to be able to give them an answer. Just like 1 Peter 3:15. If someone asks you about the hope that lies within you, you need to be able to give them an answer to that. And if you can't, then you need to go back and figure out what you actually believe in. And it amazes me how many people are just following along with this anti-freedom crowd, because it's an emotion. It's everything is done on emotion. This is a crisis. This is going to kill mankind. This is going to kill your children. So we have to do something about it now. That's how the anti-freedom group crouches all their ideology. That everything is a crisis, and this is going to happen to you. Healthcare. Your grandmother and grandparents are going to be pushed over the cliff by a Republican, and, you know, just pushed off the cliff. They don't love you. They don't want you. You know, it's an emotional response, but once you get down below that emotional response and start seeing what the anti-freedom crowd does, especially like, and we have the example, we have Obamacare, it's been implemented enough years now, and I still say that they need to quit trying to replace Obamacare, just repeal the dumb thing, put a couple laws in for competition, and let the free markets take care of it. That would be the best way for it. But we've seen just in a few short years how bad Obamacare actually is, with premiums doubling, tripling, quadrupling for folks. I just read an article the other day about how, you know, it's not, the increase in premiums isn't what people think it is, and it's not as bad as they think it is. And I tried to read the article, but it was idiotic. Again, they were going on emotions. Well, if we don't do this, then people aren't going to be covered. But if people can't afford the premiums and they got to start cutting back in other parts of their lives, what's that going to do to the economy? And that's absolutely right. The policies I had in the past were junk. But getting back to the environment, everything's a crisis. Everything has to be taken care of right now, and only the government can do it. And that argument there, to me, is a paper tiger. I mean, you can walk right through that. Only the government can do everything. No, only the government. We're talking federal. Whenever I talk about government, I'm talking about federal government. There's a lot the state governments do that are wrong, but thank God most of these state governments, it only happens in their state. And if people don't like it, they either change it in their state or they walk away from the state. And that's a huge statement for the state. And it happens a lot up in the Northeast. A lot of people are moving out of the Northeast because of that. The only problem, like folks moving from New Jersey and New York down into western or eastern PA, are voting the same way they did up home and are wondering why their taxes are so high and why this is going wrong. We moved out of New York down to here thinking we're going to escape that. Well, why are you still voting the same way? And like I said, it's no different with the environment. Now, the free markets, I want to get into this. I got a couple things here. There's if you go to the DanClemShow.com show notes page for episode 813, today's show, you'll see some of these PDF abstracts. It's is trade good or bad for the environment? Sorting out the causality, and this is something that's important. Let me get is trade. Here's the abstract on this. It's not very long. It's a PDF, and this is at the beginning of these studies. They usually have a short synopsis or what they call an abstract of what the paper is going to involve. And this is by Jeffrey A. Fankel, Andrew K. Ross over at National Board of Economics Research. It's a working paper. And he says, what is the effect of trade on the country's environment for a given level of GDP? Some have observed an apparent positive correlation between openness to trade and measures of environmental quality. But this could be due to a change or variable that arises from within the model system, endogeneity or geneticity. And I just read you the definition: a change or variable that arises from within a model of the system of trade rather than a causality. This paper uses exogenous cause or produced by factors external to the model. Okay, and there's a huge difference here, and this is what a lot of times what Austrian economics actually deals with. Are there changes within the model that cause, that are causing this, that because you're changing parameters inside the model and that, or is it external factors to the model? And we should always be looking, to me anyway, looking at the external factors to the model, instead of looking at the changes in the model. I'll go back. This paper uses exogenous determinants of trade, geographical variables from the gravity model and as instruments to isolate the effect of openness. The finding is that trade may indeed have a beneficial effect on three measures of air pollution. Statistical significance is lacking for particulate matter, but is moderate for NO2 and high for SO2. Results for broader environmental measures are not as encouraging, but one can at least say that there is little evidence that trade has the detrimental effect on the environment that the race to the bottom theory would lead one to expect. The larger effect appears to come via income itself. Our results generally support the environmental Kuznets curve, and Kuznets was an economist that first started looking at business manufacturing in regards to the environment, which says that growth harms the environment at low levels of income and helps at high levels, and supports the proposition that openness to trade accelerates the growth and process. So we have that there, and this is it's a fairly long, like 24 pages or something like that. I skimmed over it, and basically it's not saying unequivocally that trade and GDP and stuff like that contributes to the environment. But what they're saying is, as a nation grows wealthier and more affluent, the environment actually gets better. And that's just a little. This is analogous to this, but if you look in poorer neighborhoods, and I have some neighbors here right in our area. Snydertown's by no means a poor town, but it is on the lower side of things, and we do have neighbors that do not live clean in their environment on their property. And it tends to drag down the rest of the property values. And, in converse, if you go to the nicer neighborhoods, there's no garbage laying around. Most of them are electric based or natural gas for heating, stuff like that. And so they're very, you look at the whole place, it's very clean because, of course they have the money to help do that, but that's the point. As a country, we have the money and we live a lifestyle that's easier for us. For me, for many years, real quick, for many years, and this past winter was my last year for burning firewood. Very dirty, very time intensive, used a lot of wood to heat my house. But economically for me, it was the cheapest way for me to go to heat my house. And not that I'm getting more affluent, I have a medical condition that's going to preclude me from continuing doing the wood. So I'm switching over to a gas boiler for this next winter, a propane. Hopefully we have natural gas coming through the town. Hopefully we'll get natural gas lines run eventually through the town. But it's going to be a more efficient. I'm not going to have to work as hard. It's going to be cleaner. The neighbors aren't going to see all the smoke in the neighborhood sometimes when you get the low pressures and stuff like that. But anyway, that's getting off the board there. So the more affluent a country is, this report says that the environment actually gets cleaner and it's healthier and it's more protected. And it's that goes against what they call there in the abstract the race to the bottom crowd. The anti-freedom crowd is always a race to the bottom with their ideology and their emotional appeals. So there's another abstract that we have here. Has surface water quality improved since the Clean Water Act? And this is another important thing because you hear about this all the time. And the abstract talks about, this is another one from the MBER. And there's a bunch, I'm not going to read them all, but there's a bunch of authors in this or people that put their hand into this. But the abstract says on the 40th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, this paper reports the first quantitative assessment of aggregate trends in the water quality in the U.S. using a single standard over the years 1975 to 2011. The analysis suggests that freshwater lakes for the nation as a whole are about the same quality levels as they were back in 1975. In short, viewed in the aggregate, nothing has changed. An assessment of the factors influencing the aggregates also suggests that water quality appears to be affected by the business cycle. This result calls into question the simple descriptions of the change in environmental quality with economic growth that are associated with the environmental Kunzit curve. And we talked about it again. Again, there's going to be a link, Wikipedia link to Mr. Kunzit and his ideology. And like I said, he was the first economist that actually looked at the causality and the relationship between economics and the environment, as far as manufacturing, capitalism, free market, stuff like that, and the environment. And again, there's a narrative out there that people believe in that doesn't matter what size of the corporation, they're all anti-environmental, they're all just polluters, and they just want to kill everybody. And that's a conclusion they come up with, and that's something that they believe in. And no matter how, and a lot of folks, no matter how many facts you put out to them, they don't want to believe that at all. Let me see if there's some more PDFs. Here's another small factor you won't hear in the lamestream media or most anywhere else. I have two other reports in there, and this all comes out of this article from libertarianrepublic.com. The free market is better for the environment than the EPA, and here's why. And some of these links were broken in the article, so I went out and found them and put them in the show notes page. It'll be at the danclemenshow.com. And one is Global Forest Resource Assessments of 2010 and the U.S. Forest Resource Facts and Historical Trends. Both of them are PDFs, so you'll be able to find them there. the important thing I want to say about this, and I've been called to task in the past. I mean, way back in, before this 2010 actually happened, because I was in the logging industry. I was a log hauler. I had my own triaxle log truck with the knuckle boom loader. I'd go out in the woods after the lumberjacks, the guys went out there timbering, drug them up to the landings and bucked them into the lengths they were, and I'd load them on my truck and take them to the sawmill for processing. And so I had a keen interest in the logging industry and what was going on. And I found out, and this is what I was taken to task about. We have more trees now, and if you look at these two PDFs from back, one's 2010, I can't remember what the other date is, the U.S. Forest Resource Facts, but there are more trees now in the United States than there was at our founding, when we actually became colonies and fought the Revolutionary War, set up our Constitution and then we call that our founding. There are more trees now than there were back then, and a lot of people scoff. There's no way. Corporations, these big paper corporations and cardboard corporations and whatever, whatever it is, lumber corporations and stuff, they're just raping the environment. And so we're actually running out of trees. And the problem with that assessment is we have companies like Georgia Pacific and I think it's Weyerhaeuser is a hammer. Weyerhaeuser Hammer. It's a paper mill, and they do cardboard paper and stuff like that. From Maine, we're talking, if you ever watched American Loggers, the pelletiers up in Maine, they harvest a lot of planted tree stands up there. From Maine all the way down into Florida, as far west as, the Rocky Mountains, or I'm going to say, let's say Arkansas, around the Mississippi water basin. They have planted trees in areas you couldn't grow anything else. They were so sandy and whatever. The soils were not good for planting anything else. So these paper companies started buying up or leasing these lands and started putting pine trees, yellow, white pine trees, and started growing these. And they did this years and years ago. We're talking, 50, 60, 80 years ago. And they've been rotating these trees out. They harvest these stands while these other stands continue to grow. They've sort of step planted, so they would always have a continual crop of trees to do, paper and all this kind of stuff. And literally, folks, they have, I've seen it because I used to haul bark a couple times, more than a couple times. Used to go in and pick up bark and take it to Lowe's, Home Depot, Walmart and stuff like that, distribution centers, palletized bags of bark. And I'd talk to the guys about these things, and I remember talking to some old timers, and they said they remember their kids, there was no trees around here. It was all flat, sandy swampland. But paper mills came in and leased and bought and planted these trees. And so we actually have more trees now than we did at the founding of our country. So there's another example of how you're being misled by the watermelon environmentalist movement out there. And this wasn't a government mandated thing to plant these trees. These were the evil corporations that saw that they would do better if, instead of trying to find new sources of trees, they create their own sources of trees. And they did. And they're still being raked across the coals for it. But the actual facts of matters do not line up with the beliefs of the watermelon environmental movement as far as it comes to forestry and the trees. This article here, The Free Market is Better for the Environment than the EPA, and Here's Why, by Grant Phillips. This was posted back in April 27, 2015 at thelibertarianrepublic.com, but I thought it would be educational for you to hear this. He says, in short time, the Environmental Protection Agency will release new standards for chemical plants and refineries to measure volatile or organic compounds in their flares. The new regulations come in response to the past lawsuit that claims the EPA failed to enforce existing regulations under the Clean Air Act. This comes as no surprise because government is inherently motivated to fail. How else will they claim they need more funding? And this is a key point that I'd like to bring out in this article here. In order for the government to continue to get money, they have to fail in order to keep getting. That is totally backwards from any type of economic study that I've ever heard of that if they fail, they get more funding. He goes on, however altruistic the regulation may be, their endeavor will not produce any meaningful benefit. The environment needs market freedom, not intrusive regulatory body. There is no better way to conserve scarce resources and reduce pollution than via the free markets. There are a multitude of pieces of evidence confirming that economic freedom is strong, and strong property rights result in a better environmental quality. The Fraser Institute studied over 100 countries from 2000 to 2010 to identify the relationship between economic freedom and the environmental quality. Fraser concluded that a permanent 1-point increase in the economic freedom of the world index results in a 71.5% decrease in concentrations of fine particulate matter in the long run. They also found that while property rights and freedom aid reduction in overall pollution, regulatory bodies do very little to reduce pollution. And there's a big link in there in this article. If you go to the danclementshow.com, episode 813, related 7 ways socialism is bad for the environment. And I went over and perused that. It's a good article, and that's a huge link in the middle of the article. But he goes, Grant goes on here. He says, additionally, researchers at Iowa State studied 12 centrally planned economies as they began privatization reforms. They found a strong relationship between market liberalization and improvements in overall environmental quality. Countries that continued central planning, however, experienced net declines. Low levels of environmental regulation are not synonymous with environmental destruction, nor are high levels with environmental improvements. For example, a quantitative assessment of the Clean Air Act Clean Water Act, and I read that abstract to you, examined water quality from 1975 to 2011. Has anything changed? On aggregate, national freshwater quality has not changed and more closely tracks with the business cycle. This suggests environmental quality tracks with economic growth. And let me stop the reading there. We have, it's called Coal Creek over here that runs through Snydertown. And when I first moved out here in 1988, that was like orange. You couldn't see the bottom of the creek. The rocks on the side were orange. And not too many years ago, the source of that water is some mines that have since closed down. The water coming out of these mines, these underground mines, has to go somewhere. And this feeds Coal Creek. Well, what they did was they did a reclamation project at the beginning where the water comes out, and they treat the water naturally. They have these big lagoons where the water's filtered through, and they got plants and some other stuff in there that actually takes turns the water orange, all the contaminants out of it, and when it comes out the other end, it's pretty well pure. Now you go down the creek, you don't see the orange rocks anymore. You can actually see the bottom of the creek, and you can actually see fish in the creek now. And that hasn't happened for I don't know how many years, ever since that mine was open, when they were pumping that water out. These things can be taken care of without government regulation. They weren't regulated to do this. This was a group of people that got together and decided to try to do something to clean up the creek. And they've done a fantastic job of that. Low levels of environmental regulation. Oh, I read that. For example, let's see here. Nobel Prize winner Simon Kuznets, and this is the wiki links I have on there, developed a U-shaped curve known as the environmental Kuznets curves. It illustrates that increasing incomes results in the increase of overall environmental quality, specifically in pollution and material waste. Environmental improvements are not immediately realized during the initial growth stage, but follow shortly after with the resulting income growth. Economists have found that the Kuznets curve is a reliable and accurate illustration of environmental trends. Trade liberalization, for example, benefits multiple measurements of environmental quality, particularly so with air pollution. At low levels of income, this may not always be the case until experiencing income gains, which is consistent with the Kuznets theory. In the words of MBER researchers, trade helps promote economic growth, which in turn is an indirect channel of the effect on the environment. And so you never hear environmentalists, the watermelon environmentalists out there cite these type of things because it doesn't fit their model. And remember, what happened to the Communist Party and socialists in America when it was really not a vogue, as it were, to be that, they went into the environmental movement because they knew through the environmental movement they could use surface level emotions, call everything a crisis, and hope you never dig down below that, because if you did, then you'd find how rotten it actually was, to try to move their socialist agenda. What they're trying to do is advance a socialist communist agenda through the environment. And this was, in essence, the Paris Climate Accords. It was a socialist communist agenda being foisted on the whole global economy. I read on here, markets also maintain sustainability of natural resources via the price mechanism. If a producer believes their resources, i.e. trees, will be worth more in the future, they will hold on to it and accept the higher price. If their trees are worth more today, then they will increase output for the present price. Privatization results in the conservation of those resources. Okay? This has especially been the case for the North American tree population, which is 70% privately owned. Okay? Since the early 20th century, there has never been a net decrease in the tree population. For example, all species of trees increased from 17,430,000 cubic meters in 1953 to 23,650 cubic meters in 1997. At least 2 million cubic meters were added every 10 years. Growth far surpasses removals even during the rise in the demand for paper. And folks, let me stop that for a second here. As we continue to get into the computer age, the demand for paper is actually going to drop. With me reading, I don't print these out anymore. I used to print these out all the time. I don't print my notes out anymore. I have them on a separate screen that I read off of, because it's not, for me it wasn't environmental. For me it was a matter of economics. And you can see just now, I know this is a small example, but you can see how I wasn't actually thinking of the environment. I was actually thinking about my pocketbook. And so I let my pocketbook and economics drive things. So instead of printing things out all the time, I read them off a computer screen. I have a Kindle reader. I don't buy a lot of books anymore. I do some books because I want them so I can annotate them. But that may be a thing of the past too, because they have this new reader out. It's about the size of a sheet of notebook paper that has a special pen you use, and you can actually load books onto them, and you can write notes and make notes of that and save them in like a PDF form. Where will I sign up? Now, it's a little expensive right now. It's like $500, but you know what? That price is actually going to come down. And that's actually going to save more trees, because some people are going to think, well, it's just easier and cheaper for me not to have a library with a bunch of books and shelves on it, which is fine. Some people still want the books and some people don't. That's their personal decision. But you can see how economics actually drives this, and as a consequence of that, and let's say, and they're not, but let's say 100 million households in the United States were doing what I'm doing, producing a show, or they're voracious readers and researchers, and they don't buy paper books. They buy everything in ebook and PDFs, and they do their notes and everything on their computers. That's a lot of trees that aren't going to have to be harvested and grown. That will eventually hurt. In the short term, that's going to hurt the paper industry until they figure out what else they can do with those trees. And that's where wisecracking entrepreneurs, that these paper companies actually are, come in and they find other uses for the trees. But you don't get that by government regulation. You don't get that innovation by government regulation, folks, at all. Now, I thought that was fascinating. Where 70% of trees are privately owned in the United States. That's great. I mean, that's where it needs to be, because private ownership actually preserves resources, doesn't waste them. According to the FAO United Nations, the U.S. ranks near the top for forest biomass growth. Property rights and overall economic freedom are the distinguishing characteristics between the top-rated country like the U.S., which added 400,000 hectares of trees from 2005 to 2010, and lower-ranked countries such as Brazil and much of Africa, which do not have a similar respect for property rights and lacks economic freedom. Now, can I say something else here? Part of the problem with the droughts and with food shortages and actual famines in northern Africa and all over the world, but let's pick on northern Africa, is due to people do not have property rights and do not have freedom to grow things on their property that they want. There was, I have to dig this back up, there was a study, and it was just a news article, I've been trying to find it, where they said that when you grow trees and you grow plants and stuff like that, it actually cools the area down. Doesn't do a global thing. We're talking about just a local ecosystem. Actually cools things down, helps retain water. And part of the problem in the poorer parts of the world, and especially in Africa, trees are harvested at such a rate because the only way people have to cook anything is to take these trees and turn them into charcoal, and then they have something they can cook with. And that's what happens in poor countries. If they don't have access to cheap fossil fuels, like the rest of the world, then they got to resort to something that's a little bit older and is not as environmentally friendly. I was going to say free, but friendly. Okay. Many economists support limited regulations to address pollution. There's no need, however, for an $8 billion bureaucracy that barely enforces their own rules. Besides the EPA, there are a litany of federal agencies, and may I add state-run agencies into that sentence that he didn't put in there, with some kind of environmental agenda. While their plans may be grandiose, they ultimately prove ineffective. We can effectively protect the environment by protecting property rights and the free market. That was a very good article, very well researched, which my anti-freedom crowd doesn't like. Okay, they just don't like that at all. So we have here this whole ideology of protecting the environment and the best way to do it. The watermelon environmentalists are going to try to convince people that the best way to do that is government, because if it's through the government, then they can grow government and they can get their socialist, communist agenda enforced through the environment. Okay, that's their ultimate goal. We've seen the mine spill out west, you know, where the EPA was in charge of that whole site. And because the EPA was in charge of the site and they were doing the work and stuff, it wasn't done up to snuff to protect the environment, and they ruined the river for a long, long time. Again, in Pennsylvania, we have a Department of Environmental Protection here that does a good job of protecting the environment at a state level, which that's where it needs to be. That's where it needs to be. And there was and I'm going to be doing a short video on this. There was a senator asking the EPA director about this, about the Great Lakes, why the federal government shouldn't spend money on the Great Lakes, because it's a common good. And we'll talk about this on Monday or Tuesday show. We're going to talk about common good. And it was asked, why should taxpayers in Arkansas have tax dollars taken out of their pocket to do something to the Great Lakes when this is something local? Because the Great Lakes does not benefit the whole country. It just doesn't. Now, the anti-freedom group will tell you, well, yeah, it supplies to Mississippi, blah, 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 blah. And they really don't know their geography. They don't know that the Great Lakes Basin does not supply the Mississippi River. It actually goes out to sea through the St. Lawrence Seaway, things like that. Just simple things that can be known by folks and actually can be researched and found out. So, again, it's a cultural battle, folks. It's freedom versus anti-freedom. It's free market capitalism versus socialism and communism. And that's what Bernie Sanders promotes, socialism, communism. He's a socialist Democrat, which means he believes in democracy, that if 51% of the population of the United States wants something, that we should give it to them, even though they don't. And again, I don't say this to diss anybody out there. But a lot of people don't know what they don't know. A lot of people do not know what they actually believe. And a lot of people are running on emotions. They have a conclusion, a foregone conclusion in their mind. They're only going to listen to things that actually support that. If something comes along that's factual and truthful that doesn't support their conclusion, they're just going to ignore it out of hand and just dismiss it. And just tell you you're wrong. And usually, it's been my experience, when I'm told I'm wrong, there's a lot of profanity and a lot of adjectives that are added onto that to why I'm wrong. There's no facts, there's no truth, there's no well, this is what this study actually says about that, and here's the references to that study. It usually ends up in, like I said, profanity and adjectives as to why you're wrong, which really only speaks to the weakness of their argument, not the strength of mine. And like I said, always, I'm going to wrap up the show here, but always attack the ideology, never, ever attack the individual. Because what does the individual have to do with it? You know, the actual person. It's their ideas. It's what they've been raised on. It's what they were taught. It's what they believe, whether they've researched it or not. So only attack the ideas. Never go personal on these. And folks, trust me when I tell you, I used to, a long, long time ago, I used to go personal on people about this kind of stuff, and it didn't get me anywhere. And now that I quit doing that for a long time now, years, pretty much ever since I restarted the program a few years back, I've actually had people that come back and said, you know, I went and read that and checked the references, and you know what? Gave me some food for thought. I'm going to have to think about that. Praise God, hallelujah. You know, that they just didn't dismiss it out of hand. They went and did some reading and research on their own. Now that gives them something to think about. And hopefully they're going to start really digging into what they actually believe and come to the conclusion that what they believed before isn't actually so. And let me tell you this here in closing on the show here before I wrap everything up. Never, ever, 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 ever be afraid to examine what you believe. And if you find what you believe to be incorrect, unfactual, untruthful, unfounded, never, ever, ever, ever be afraid to change. People are afraid to change because they're afraid of what their friends are going to say to them, what their family's going to say or think of them, and they never stop to think about themselves. Because everything they've been, all their false beliefs, everything's been external. Nothing's been internalized on them. Once they start internalizing and owning these things, then they'll come to find and see that, okay, you may lose some friends and you may have some family members that quit talking to you, but guess what? They've just opened themselves up to another set of friends and family and community that they didn't know was out there before because of their beliefs kept them from recognizing that they were out there. And folks, that's a sad situation to be in. That's a sad state of affairs to actually live your life in. And we should never, ever be afraid to examine what we believe. All right? Well, folks, that's the music. That's the end of the show. Hope you enjoyed it. I appreciate you being here. Have a great rest of the day, folks, and God bless. And have a great weekend. On Sunday, please attend the Church of God's Choice. Tomorrow is Saturday with Psalm. He's going to be at the Susquehanna Valley Church of Christ in Selinsgrove, PA, giving 3 lessons, and he'll be preaching and giving a lesson on Sunday morning about his walk from Islam to Christianity. It's going to be some powerful stuff. I hope you can make it. And remember, on Sunday, attend the Church of God's Choice. This has been the Dan Clements Show. I'm your host, Dan Clements, your constitutional warrior. Remember, if you aim at nothing, you hit it every time. Have a great rest of the day, and God bless.